In part 1 of our Syrian Campaign saga, the Islamic armies embarked on an impossible invasion. Upon the direct orders of Caliph Abu Bakr, 4 Muslim armies marched north into Roman territory, but they were soon pinned down by overwhelming imperial forces. To save the campaign, the sword of Allah, Khalid ibn al-Walid, executed one of the most daring military maneuvers in human history. He led his veteran army on a suicidal march across the waterless Syrian desert from Iraq. Striking like a thunderbolt from the wasteland, Khalid shattered the Roman defences at Arak, brought down the mighty black walls of Bosra, and crushed the imperial army in the brutal, bloody meat grinder of Ajnadin. But the Roman Empire was far from defeated. The greatest prize in the Levant still stood defiant. In this part, the desert warriors set their sights on the ancient, towering jewel of Syria, Damascus. You will witness the grueling, high-stakes siege of Damascus and the brilliant tactical mind of Khalid as he outmaneuvers desperate Roman relief forces. From the muddy, blood-soaked trap at Fahl to the lightning-fast conquests of Marj al-Rum, Baalbek, and the strategic northern stronghold of Emesa, the Islamic war machine seems absolutely unstoppable. City after imperial city surrenders to the supreme command of Abu Ubaidah. But Emperor Heraclius refuses to let Syria fall. Fuming with rage in Antioch, the emperor summons a terrifying, apocalyptic coalition of up to 150,000 heavily armoured men, tasked with one singular objective: to wipe the Arabs off the face of the earth. Facing absolute annihilation, the Muslim commanders make a shocking, masterstroke decision: the Great Retreat. They deliberately abandon their hard-won conquests. They give up Damascus. They give up Emesa. They execute a flawless retrograde movement, falling back hundreds of miles, stretching the Roman supply lines, and pulling the massive imperial juggernaut directly into a masterfully calculated trap. The talking ends. The psychological warfare reaches its peak. The chessboard is finally set for the greatest battle in ancient history. This is the conquest of Syria, and this is the road to Yarmouk. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Historic War Lens, hit the like button, and ring the bell so you never miss a new episode. If you enjoy our deep dives into history, consider supporting us on Patreon. The dust of Ajnadain had barely settled, but the geopolitical map of the world had already been redrawn. Tens of thousands of imperial Roman soldiers had been shattered. General Vardan was dead. The Roman field army in Palestine was effectively erased from existence. For the first time in centuries, the paved Roman roads of the Levant lay completely undefended. The victorious Muslim army, numbering around 20,000 to 30,000 hardened veterans, stood as the undisputed masters of the open field. But Khalid ibn al-Walid knew that defeating an army in the field was only half the war. To truly conquer Syria, to permanently break the Roman grip on the Middle East, he had to take its stone heart. He had to capture Damascus. But a terrifying tactical question hung over the Rashidun camp. How does an army of light infantry and cavalry, completely lacking heavy siege engines, catapults, or battering rams, breach the greatest walls in the ancient world? As we prepare to witness the most pivotal siege of the Syrian campaign, Damascus was not just a city, it was a fortress of legendary proportions. Known throughout the ancient world as the Pearl of the East, it was one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. It sat nestled within the lush Ghouta oasis, a massive, fertile paradise of orchards, crops, and rivers that provided endless sustenance. Guarding this paradise was a terrifying ring of fortifications. The city was enclosed by a massive, perfectly engineered Roman stone wall towering over the landscape. These walls were so thick that chariots could ride along the upper ramparts. Surrounding this colossal stone barrier was a water-filled moat, fed continuously by the Barada River. To even touch the stone walls, an attacking army had to swim or bridge this treacherous water under a relentless, plunging hail of iron-tipped arrows and projectiles. The city was accessed by 6 main gates. Each gate was a heavily fortified choke point, featuring thick iron-studded wooden doors and flanking watchtowers designed to turn any direct infantry assault into a brutal slaughter. For a highly mobile, light-armored desert force like the Rashidun, a frontal assault on Damascus bordered on military suicide. 250 miles to the north, in the capital of Antioch, the devastating news of Ajnadain reached Emperor Heraclius. The emperor was horrified. The Arab invasion he had dismissed as a minor border raid had just butchered his greatest field army. Realizing that Damascus was the next logical target, and that the loss of the city would mean the loss of southern Syria forever, Heraclius took immediate action. He needed a commander who would not break under the psychological terror that Khalid inflicted on his enemies. He chose his own son-in-law, a fiercely devout and brilliant patrician named Thomas. Thomas was not an arrogant frontline brawler like Vardan. He was a cold, calculating, and resolute defensive strategist. Heraclius gave Thomas absolute command of the Damascus garrison, heavily reinforcing the city with thousands of elite imperial troops, expert archers, and Greek engineers. Thomas immediately went to work. He stripped the surrounding Ghouta oasis of all grain, livestock, and supplies, pulling everything behind the massive iron gates. He deepened the moat. He mounted heavy ballistas on the ramparts. By the time the Muslims began their march north, Damascus was a fully stocked, impenetrable island of iron and stone, prepared to hold out for years. Thomas was confident. He didn't need to defeat Khalid ibn al-Walid in open combat. He just needed to hide behind his massive walls and let the harsh Syrian winter and the impenetrable defenses break the Muslim army. In August 634 AD, the Muslim army began its relentless march north. Khalid pushed his men hard. He knew that time was the greatest enemy in any siege. If he gave Thomas too much time to fortify, or if Emperor Heraclius managed to raise a massive new relief army in the north, the Muslims would be crushed between the anvil of the city walls and the hammer of a new Byzantine force. As the Rashidun cavalry crossed into the lush green expanse of the Ghouta oasis, the sheer scale of the challenge loomed on the horizon. The great stone walls of Damascus rose above the orchards like a man-made mountain range. The Muslim veterans, who had just defeated the Roman Empire in the open field, stared up at fortifications unlike anything they had ever seen in the deserts of Arabia or the plains of Iraq. Khalid ibn al-Walid rode out with his senior commanders, Abu Ubaidah, Amr bin al-As, Yazid, and Shurabil, to personally survey the defenses. They rode their horses just outside the maximum range of the Byzantine archers, meticulously studying the width of the moat, the height of the stone, and the positioning of the massive iron gates. Khalid's tactical mind processed the battlefield. He instantly recognized that a frontal assault would be a massacre. Any attempt to scale those walls without massive wooden siege towers would result in the complete annihilation of his army. If they could not take the city by force, they would have to take it by starvation. Khalid decided on a strategy of absolute, airtight isolation. He would cut off every road, every supply line, and every communication route. He would choke the Pearl of the East until it surrendered. But to do this, he had to stretch his thousands of men around a massive, miles-long perimeter. This was incredibly dangerous. Surrounding the city meant dividing his army into smaller, isolated camps, leaving his forces vulnerable to a massive, sudden counterattack from the thousands of heavily armed Roman soldiers waiting inside the gates. To execute this risky blockade, Khalid had to trust his commanders implicitly. He divided his army into distinct corps, assigning each of his most trusted generals to blockade a specific gate. The deployment was a masterclass in siege logistics and delegation. Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah, the steady and unbreakable veteran, was sent to the western perimeter, tasked with blockading the Jabiyah Gate. Yazid bin Abu Sufyan was ordered to take the southern perimeter, securing the Small Gate and the Kisan Gate. Amr bin al-As, the tactical genius of the right wing at Ajnadin, was positioned at the Thomas Gate in the north. Shurabil was sent to secure the Faradis Gate, and Khalid himself took command of the main strike force, setting up his personal camp directly opposite the most heavily fortified entrance of them all, the East Gate. To ensure that Emperor Heraclius could not surprise them with a relief army from the north, Khalid also dispatched a flying column of elite cavalry miles up the road toward Antioch to act as an early warning screen. The trap was flawlessly set. The great city of Damascus was completely cut off from the outside world. The greatest siege of the Syrian campaign had officially begun. But Thomas, pacing the high stone ramparts and looking down at the scattered Muslim camps, was not a man who would simply sit in the dark and wait to starve. He was already planning his first deadly counterstrike. The siege of Damascus did not begin with a glorious, massive charge. It began with a suffocating, terrifying stalemate. For the first few weeks, the reality of ancient siege warfare set in. The massive iron-studded gates of the city remained completely sealed. The deep, water-filled moat created an impassable physical barrier. And towering high above, the heavily armored Roman garrison stared down at the scattered Muslim camps. Thomas, the brilliant Roman commander, knew exactly how to use his geographical advantage. From the high stone ramparts, his Greek engineers operated heavy ballistas, massive, terrifying torsion engines capable of launching thick wooden bolts with enough force to pierce straight through a man and a horse. Any Muslim warrior who strayed too close to the moat was instantly targeted. A relentless, deadly rain of iron-tipped arrows poured down from the Roman archers stationed on the towers. But the Muslims did not simply sit in the dirt and take the punishment. Khalid ibn al-Walid ordered his own expert archers forward. Hardened by years of desert warfare, the Muslim bowmen crept to the absolute edge of their maximum range. They engaged in deadly, daily sniper duels with the Romans on the walls. The Muslim archers were incredibly accurate, forcing the Byzantine defenders to keep their heads down behind the heavy stone battlements. But Thomas was a calculating strategist. He looked down at the Muslim deployment and saw a glaring opportunity. By surrounding the massive city, Khalid had been forced to stretch his men incredibly thin. The Muslim army was divided into 6 separate camps, one at each major gate. Thomas realized that if he could quickly mass his heavy infantry inside the city and launch a sudden, overwhelming surprise attack out of just one gate, he could annihilate an isolated Muslim camp before the others could march to its rescue. Khalid ibn Walid, however, had already anticipated this exact Roman tactic. To prevent his divided army from being destroyed in detail, Khalid engineered a brilliant, highly responsive communication and reinforcement network. He established a constant rotation of fast-riding scouts patrolling the perimeter between the 6 camps. More importantly, Khalid held back his most elite, battle-hardened cavalry as a rapid reaction mobile reserve at the East Gate. If Abu Ubaidah at the western Jabiyah Gate or Amr bin al-As at the northern Thomas Gate came under sudden Roman attack, they only had to hold the line for a matter of minutes. Khalid's mobile elite would hear the war horns and instantly gallop across the Ghouta oasis to smash into the flanks of the Roman sortie. Understanding that direct combat was currently too risky, both sides engaged in brutal psychological warfare. Khalid deployed his terrifying elite duelists, the Mubarizun. Every day, the naked champion, Dirar bin al-Azwar, and his men would ride right up to the edge of the moat, They would shout up at the towering walls, taunting the Roman officers, questioning their bravery, and goading them to come down and fight like men in single combat. It was a tactic that had broken the discipline of Byzantine armies in the open field. But Thomas was not Varden. Thomas possessed an iron will. He strictly forbade his officers from accepting the duels. He ordered his men to stay behind the stone, hold their formations, and let the sheer frustration of the impenetrable walls break the Arab morale. And Thomas had another reason to be confident. As the grueling weeks dragged on and the heat of the Syrian summer began to give way to the creeping chill of autumn, a massive shift occurred in the atmosphere of the siege. One morning, a sudden, deafening roar of cheers erupted from the high stone walls of Damascus. The Roman soldiers were banging their swords against their shields, shouting in triumph. The Muslim commanders looked up, confused by the sudden surge in Byzantine morale. The terrifying truth soon arrived at Khalid's command tent. The flying column of light cavalry that Khalid had sent miles to the north, acting as an early warning screen, came galloping back into the camp at the east gate. The scouts were exhausted, their horses covered in foam. They delivered world-shattering news. Emperor Heraclius had not abandoned his crown jewel. Furious at the disaster of Ajnadin, the emperor had emptied his garrisons in Antioch and northern Syria. He had assembled a massive, fresh imperial relief army. Tens of thousands of heavily armored Roman reinforcements were currently marching rapidly south, directly down the paved Roman roads. Their orders were simple: march to Damascus, smash into the rear of the Muslim army, and crush Khalid ibn al-Walid against the city walls. The hunters had suddenly become the hunted. Khalid was now trapped in the ultimate strategic nightmare. In front of him were the impregnable stone walls of Damascus, garrisoned by thousands of troops under a brilliant, patient commander. And marching rapidly toward his exposed back was a fresh, colossal Roman juggernaut. If Khalid stayed, his army would be caught in a massive anvil and hammer attack, leading to total annihilation. If he abandoned the siege to fight the relief army, Thomas would sally out from Damascus and attack his rear. The siege of Damascus had just become a desperate fight for ultimate survival, and Khalid ibn al-Walid was about to make a decision that would redefine military history. In the late summer of 634 AD, Khalid ibn Walid stared at the colossal stone walls of Damascus, knowing that the greatest trap of his military career was closing around him. He had successfully encircled the Pearl of the East, choking off its supplies and trapping its heavy Roman garrison inside. But the siege had suddenly turned into a race against time, and time had just run out. Scouts from Khalid's elite cavalry screen, riding hard from the north, delivered the horrifying news. Emperor Heraclius had dispatched a massive, fresh Roman relief army from the northern stronghold of Emesa. 12,000 heavily armed imperial soldiers were currently force-marching down the paved Roman roads, heading directly for the Muslim rear. Khalid was now caught in a classic, deadly military dilemma: the anvil and the hammer. The towering, impenetrable walls of Damascus, garrisoned by thousands of troops under the brilliant Roman commander Thomas, was the anvil. The 12,000-man relief army marching rapidly from the north was the hammer. If Khalid maintained his siege, the relief army would smash into his exposed back. The moment the fighting started, Thomas would throw open the massive iron gates of Damascus and pour his heavy infantry out, crushing the 32,000 Muslim veterans between two massive Roman forces. It would be a total, catastrophic slaughter. But if Khalid lifted the siege and marched his entire army north to fight the relief force, he would surrender all the momentum he had gained. Thomas would be free to restock the city, reinforce the walls, and the entire Syrian campaign would effectively reset to zero. Khalid ibn al-Walid refused to surrender the siege. He refused to let the Romans dictate the terms of the war. He decided on a terrifying, high-stakes gamble. He would fight both armies at the exact same time. To execute this, Khalid had to split his forces. He placed the legendary, unbreakable veteran Abu Ubaidah bin al-Jarrah in supreme command of the siege ring around Damascus. Abu Ubaidah's orders were absolute. Under no circumstances could the blockade be broken. The Roman garrison must remain trapped. Meanwhile, Khalid gathered his elite mobile guard, a highly disciplined, lightning-fast cavalry strike force numbering roughly 5,000 men. Leaving the infantry behind to hold the trenches, Khalid and the mobile guard rode hard to the north, vanishing into the Syrian landscape to intercept the emperor's relief army before it could reach the city. Just under 20 miles south of Damascus lay the plains of Marj al-Safar. The Roman relief army, marching in heavy columns, expected to meet the Arab forces right at the walls of Damascus. They did not expect to be violently intercepted in the open field. As the Roman vanguard marched through the plains of Marj al-Safar, the horizon suddenly darkened with dust. Without warning, Khalid ibn al-Walid's mobile guard descended upon them. The Muslim cavalry strike was a masterclass in shock warfare. Operating with terrifying speed and coordination, the light Arabian horses easily outmaneuvered the heavier, slower Roman formations. Before the Roman infantry could properly deploy their massive phalanxes or lock their shields, the Muslim cavalry tore into their flanks. It was not a prolonged, grinding battle like Ajnadin. It was a rapid, surgical dismantling. The Roman command structure, caught completely off guard, panicked. As the flanks collapsed under the relentless hit-and-run charges of Khalid's veterans, the Roman formation completely shattered. The relief army broke and fled back toward the north, leaving several dead in the grass of Marj al-Safar. In a matter of hours, Emperor Heraclius's great hammer had been completely destroyed. Back in Damascus, days earlier, Thomas paced along the high stone ramparts, gazing out over the Ghouta oasis. He had watched from the walls as Khalid ibn al-Walid and 5,000 elite cavalry rode north to intercept the emperor's relief army. For the Roman commander, this was a terrifying development, but also a fleeting, golden opportunity. By taking his highly mobile reserve away from the city, Khalid had dangerously thinned the Muslim blockade. Thomas knew he could not remain behind his walls, waiting to see who would prevail in the north. If the emperor's relief army were destroyed, he would be left completely, utterly isolated. If he waited for Khalid to return to the siege camps, this window of opportunity would vanish forever. He had to strike now, while the sword of Allah was still miles away. In ancient siege warfare, when a defending garrison realizes that external relief is impossible, two things happen. They either immediately surrender, or they fight with the terrifying, savage desperation of a cornered wolf. Thomas was the emperor's son-in-law. Surrender was not an option. If he stayed behind the walls, his city would slowly starve to death. His only option left was to break the Muslim blockade himself. He had to launch a massive, overwhelming sortie to destroy the Muslim camps, shatter their morale, and force them to retreat back to the desert. Thomas spent days secretly massing his troops inside the city. He did not plan to attack just one gate. He planned a synchronized, multi-gate offensive designed to overwhelm the Muslim perimeter all at once. But Thomas knew that the Muslim infantry was lethal in close-quarters combat. To soften them up, he gathered thousands of elite Roman and Syrian archers, the finest marksmen in the Levant. He lined them up along the high stone ramparts, completely covering the battlements. He ordered them to dip their heavy, iron-tipped arrows into a deadly, toxic poison. On a cold morning in September 634 AD, the silence of the siege was suddenly broken by the deafening roar of Byzantine war horns echoing from inside the city. In the Muslim camps below, the Muslims grabbed their swords and shields, rushing to the barricades. They looked up at the towering walls. The sky above Damascus suddenly turned black. A massive, terrifying storm of poisoned iron was unleashed. Thomas had struck back. For days, the Muslim army had been the besiegers. In a matter of seconds, they became the hunted. The sky above Damascus disappeared behind a massive, dark cloud of iron. Thousands of elite Roman and Syrian archers, stationed shoulder to shoulder along the high stone ramparts, unleashed a synchronized, devastating volley. The sound of thousands of bowstrings snapping at once echoed across the Ghouta oasis like thunder. When the arrows hit the Muslim camps, the impact was catastrophic. The Muslims were lightly armored, relying on speed and agility. They had no heavy testudo formations to hide under. The sheer volume of the Byzantine arrow storm pinned the Muslim infantry completely to the ground. But these were not standard arrows. Thomas had ordered his archers to coat their iron tips in a lethal, fast-acting poison. Even a minor graze on an arm or a leg became a fatal, agonizing wound. Panic threatened to tear through the Rashidun lines as men began to collapse from the toxins. And then the true nightmare began. While the Muslim warriors were pinned down, desperately raising their leather shields against the poisoned rain, the massive iron-studded gates of Damascus began to grind open. Not just one gate, but several at the exact same time. From the dark archways of the city, the heavy Byzantine infantry, the skoutatoi, poured out. Thomas had timed the sortie perfectly. This was not a chaotic mob. This was a highly disciplined, heavily armoured Roman phalanx executing a flawless combined arms assault. The heavy infantry formed a solid wall of iron-rimmed oval shields and thrusting spears, marching relentlessly out of the gates to crush the pinned Muslim camps. On the western side of the city, at the Jabir Gate, the situation was rapidly disintegrating into a slaughter. Abu Ubaidah, the supreme commander of the siege ring, watched as the Roman heavy infantry marched over the moat bridges, driving their spear wall straight into the Muslim barricades. The lightly armoured Arab defenders were being pushed back by the sheer, crushing weight of the Roman formation. Seeing his lines buckling under the pressure, Abu Ubaidah drew his sword, refusing to let the blockade collapse. The legendary veteran threw himself directly into the meat grinder, leading from the absolute front. His presence instantly rallied the terrified men. The Muslims dug their heels into the dirt, meeting the Roman shield wall in a brutal claustrophobic melee of flashing steel and shattering wood. Simultaneously, at the northern perimeter, an equally desperate struggle was unfolding. Thomas himself had descended from the ramparts. Wearing rich imperial armor, the emperor's son-in-law personally led the heaviest Roman sortie out of the gate that bore his name. Here, the Muslim line was commanded by the tactical genius Amr bin al-As. Amr knew that if he tried to fight the heavy Byzantine infantry head-on, his men would be ground into dust. Instead, Amr initiated a brilliant fighting retreat. He ordered his men to slowly give ground, absorbing the shock of the Roman advance, while his archers targeted the exposed gaps in the Byzantine shield wall. It was a masterclass in damage control, but Amr was rapidly running out of space. The Roman numbers were too overwhelming. The entire Muslim blockade around Damascus was fracturing. Thomas's desperate gambit was working. The siege was moments away from being permanently broken. But Thomas had miscalculated one critical factor. He believed that Khalid ibn al-Walid and his mobile guard were still far to the north, engaged with the emperor's approaching relief army. Suddenly, a terrifying sound pierced the chaos of the battlefield. It was not a Roman war horn. It was the deep, haunting blast of Arabian horns from the south. Thundering across the Ghouta oasis in a massive cloud of dust, Khalid ibn Walid and his elite cavalrymen of the mobile guard were charging at a full, desperate gallop. Leaving the destroyed relief army behind in the north, Khalid had force-marched his cavalry back to Damascus with impossible speed. Khalid did not slow down to assess the battlefield. He saw the Roman infantry pushed far out from the gates, deeply engaged with Amr bin al-As and the Muslim defenders. The Roman flanks were completely exposed. Khalid raised his sword, and the mobile guard hit the Roman ranks like a thunderbolt. The impact was devastating. The light Arabian war horses crashed into the vulnerable sides of the Roman phalanx. The Roman infantry, entirely focused on the troops in front of them, was completely blindsided. The heavy Roman formations instantly buckled under the kinetic shock of the cavalry charge. As Thomas desperately tried to rally his collapsing flank, he exposed his command group. A disciplined volley of Muslim arrows rained down from Amr's retreating archers. One of those arrows found its mark, striking Thomas directly in his right eye. The emperor's son-in-law screamed in agony, collapsing back into his guards. Seeing their supreme commander critically wounded, and with Khalid's cavalry carving a bloody path through their ranks, the Roman discipline instantly shattered. Panic ripped through the Roman lines. Realizing that the element of surprise was gone and his army was being surrounded, the bleeding Thomas made a cold, calculated decision. He ordered the immediate retreat. The Roman war horns sounded the recall. The heavy infantry frantically backed away, using their massive shields to fend off the relentless cavalry strikes as they funneled back across the moat bridges. The moment the last Roman soldier stepped inside, the massive iron-studded gates of Damascus slammed shut. The heavy wooden beams dropped into place. The sortie was over. The battlefield fell eerily silent, save for the groans of the dying. The plains outside the city were a horrific sight, completely covered in a thick carpet of poisoned arrows and the bodies of fallen warriors from both sides. In the medical tents, Muslim surgeons worked frantically to save the Muslims struck by the toxic arrows. It was a harrowing, brutal display of endurance. Khalid ibn al-Walid rode through the shattered Muslim camps. His army had survived the anvil and the hammer, but the cost had been agonizing. The blockade had held. Emperor Heraclius's relief army was dead, and Thomas's massive counterattack had failed. The garrison of Damascus had played its final card. No more reinforcements were coming. There were no more great sorties to launch. There was only the slow, suffocating grip of starvation. But as the brutal Syrian winter approached, freezing the ground and punishing the besieging army in their tents, Khalid realized that simply waiting for Thomas to starve was no longer an option. The siege had to end. The sword of Allah began to look at the impregnable stone walls not as an obstacle, but as a puzzle. And he was about to find the one tiny crack in the armor of the greatest city in the east. September, 634 AD. The siege of Damascus had dragged into its brutal third month. The colossal Byzantine fortress city had survived the anvil and the hammer. Emperor Heraclius's relief army had been annihilated at Marj al-Safar, and Commander Thomas's massive, multi-gate counterattack had been violently pushed back behind the city walls. But as the adrenaline of the summer battles faded, a new, terrifying enemy crept into the Rashidun camps. The bitter Syrian winter. The lush green orchards of the Ghouta oasis withered. Freezing winds howled across the plains, biting through the light desert cloaks of the Arab soldiers. The Muslim army was built for speed, mobility, and open field dominance, not for sitting static in freezing mud outside an impenetrable stone wall. Inside the city, Roman commander Thomas knew this. He had lost his relief force, and he had lost thousands of men in his failed sortie, but he still held the ultimate high ground. Damascus was heavily stocked with grain, oil and weapons. Thomas's strategy shifted from aggressive counterattacks to a cold, calculating war of attrition. He would simply sit behind his massive limestone walls, stay warm, and watch the desert warriors freeze and starve outside. Khalid ibn al-Walid understood the grim reality of the changing weather. His army's morale was an iron shield, but even iron shatters if left in the freezing cold long enough. Simply waiting was no longer a viable military strategy. The siege had to end. The Sword of Allah began personally scouting the imposing perimeter, searching desperately for a weakness. And in the dead of night, that weakness finally presented itself. It didn't come in the form of a crumbling wall or a broken gate. It came in the form of a single, desperate man. His name was Yuhanna, known in Western histories as Jonah the Greek. Jonah was not a soldier. He was a wealthy, influential citizen of Damascus. For months, the suffocating lockdown of the siege had delayed his wedding to his betrothed. But as the blockade dragged on, Jonah's frustration morphed into a dark, terrifying realization. He looked at the dwindling morale inside the city, the failure of the emperor's relief army, and the unbreakable ring of Muslim campfires outside the walls. Jonah made a cold, calculated bet against the Roman Empire. He believed the city was going to fall sooner or later, and when it did, he wanted to ensure his own survival. Under the cover of pitch-black darkness, Jonah slipped over the massive walls of Damascus, evaded the Roman sentries, and surrendered himself directly to the Muslim blockade. He demanded to be taken to the supreme commander. When brought before Khalid ibn al-Walid, Jonah offered the ultimate prize, the exact time and place to shatter the impregnable defenses of Damascus. Jonah revealed that the following night, the entire city would be celebrating a major religious festival. The governor of Damascus had recently celebrated the birth of a son, and the city's elite, along with the exhausted garrison, were taking a night off to feast and drink. More importantly, Jonah provided Khalid with a specific tactical vulnerability. Because of the festival, the eastern gate, Bab Sharqi, would be incredibly lightly guarded. The Roman sentries, believing the freezing weather and the deep moat made an Arab attack impossible, would be drunk or asleep. Khalid listened intently. This was not a general assault. Sending thousands of men toward the eastern gate would alert the sentries, sound the alarm, and turn the moat into a watery grave for his army. To exploit this tiny, fleeting window of opportunity, Khalid had to execute something the Roman Empire had never seen from the Arab armies. He couldn't use a hammer. He had to use a scalpel. He planned a highly classified, deep infiltration commando raid, and he was going to lead it himself. Khalid selected exactly 100 of his most elite, battle-hardened veterans. He specifically chose men known for their extreme physical strength and absolute silent discipline. Among them were legendary champions like Kaka ibn Amr, a man Khalid famously claimed was worth 1,000 regular soldiers, and the fearless Mazur ibn Adi. The plan was incredibly dangerous. If they were spotted while crossing the moat or scaling the wall, they would be isolated, trapped against the stone, and slaughtered by Roman archers before the main army could even reach them. Deep in the night, the freezing wind howled, providing the perfect auditory cover. Khalid and his 100 phantoms left the warmth of their campfires. They left their horses behind. They wore dark clothing and silenced their armor to prevent any clinking of metal. They approached the eastern wall of Damascus in total, absolute silence. Standing before them was the deep, freezing water of the defensive moat, and beyond it, the smooth, towering limestone wall of Bab Sharqi. Khalid, Kaka, and Mazur waded into the freezing, cold water. To cross silently without splashing, the ancient sources report they used inflated goat skins as buoyancy aids. The water was agonizingly cold, numbing their limbs as they slowly, silently paddled across the dark moat until their hands touched the freezing stone foundation of the city wall. Looking up, The top of the parapet was cloaked in darkness. There were no torches burning directly above them. Jonah's intelligence was accurate. Khalid ibn al-Walid, possessing immense upper body strength, took the lead. Using a heavy iron grappling hook attached to a thick rope, he swung it silently in the dark. He threw it upward. The iron hook bit into the stone edge of the parapet high above. The three men froze, holding their breath, waiting for a Roman sentry to shout the alarm. Nothing but the howling wind. The festival was roaring deep inside the city. Testing his weight on the rope, Khalid began the grueling vertical climb up the sheer stone face. Hand over hand, his muscles burning in the freezing air, the legendary warrior hauled himself upward into the darkness. Khalid and Mazur followed right behind him, ascending the rope like shadows. When Khalid silently pulled himself over the ledge and dropped onto the stone walkway of the wall, he found exactly what the defector had promised. The Roman sentries assigned to watch the eastern sector were incapacitated, deep asleep, reeking of heavy wine. Without a sound, the three Muslim commanders drew their daggers. Moving with lethal, surgical precision, they eliminated the sleeping guards. The eastern wall was officially secured. Khalid immediately dropped thick, heavy rope ladders down the inside of the city wall, signaling to the 100 elite veterans waiting in the dark below. Like a stream of black ninjas, the heavily armed Muslim shock troops rapidly scaled the wall and flooded onto the parapets. Damascus was breached, but they were still only 100 men inside a fortress of tens of thousands. The mission was only half complete. Leaving a small detachment to hold the wall, Khalid led his strike team down the heavy stone staircases, descending silently into the dark streets of the city. Their objective was the massive, iron-studded wooden doors of the east gate itself. Approaching the gatehouse from the inside, they encountered the inner guard detail. This time, there was no stealth. Khalid drew his Arabian sword. Khalid and the veterans surged forward with terrifying kinetic fury. The brief, brutal close-quarters melee in the gatehouse was a slaughter. The surprised, unarmored Roman guards were annihilated before they could even sound the city's alarm horns. Khalid stepped over the bodies and approached the colossal locking mechanism of Bab Shaki. His men violently smashed the heavy iron padlocks, lifted the massive wooden crossbeams, and grabbed the giant iron ring handles. With a deafening, agonizing groan of ancient hinges, the massive eastern gates of Damascus were pushed wide open, revealing the pitch-black Syrian night outside. Waiting perfectly positioned in the darkness outside the gate was the entire Rashidun vanguard, fully armed, mounted, and ready for war. Khalid ibn al-Walid stepped into the open gateway. Raising his blooded sword high into the freezing night air, the supreme commander shattered the silence of the siege with a roaring battle cry, "Allahu Akbar!" The cry was instantly echoed by thousands of Muslim cavalrymen waiting in the dark. The sound hit the city of Damascus like a physical shockwave. The trap had been sprung. The Muslim vanguard spurred their horses, violently charging through the open gates and pouring into the eastern streets of the city like an unstoppable tidal wave of steel and hooves. The impenetrable fortress had fallen. The eastern half of Damascus was consumed by absolute chaos, fire, and fury, as the Romans woke to find the desert warriors inside their homes. But as Khalid drove his vanguard deeper into the city, violently fighting street by street toward the center, he had absolutely no idea that on the complete opposite side of Damascus, an entirely different, incredibly strange historical event was taking place. An event that was about to create one of the most bizarre and complicated legal nightmares in military history. The eastern gate of Damascus was wide open. The absolute worst nightmare of the Roman Empire had become a reality. Khalid ibn al-Walid and his elite Rashidun cavalry poured into the ancient streets of the city. The element of surprise was total. The Roman garrison, exhausted from months of freezing blockade and still recovering from their festival, was caught completely off guard. For the Roman soldiers stationed in the eastern sector, there was no time to form shield walls. There was no time to sound the general alarm. Khalid's vanguard moved with terrifying speed, sweeping through the narrow alleys, putting any armed resistance to the straight Arabian sword. The eastern half of Damascus fell into a chaotic, bloody urban brawl. Deep inside the city centre, the sounds of city breach finally reached the command quarters of the Roman governor and his supreme military commander, Thomas. When the frantic messengers arrived, bloodied and breathless, shouting that Khalid ibn al-Walid and his forces were already inside the city walls, Thomas realized the situation was critical. He understood the ancient rules of war. A city taken by force, Anwatan, was subject to strict military terms. The garrison would be neutralized, the city's defenses secured, and his own position in jeopardy. Khalid ibn al-Walid was known for his decisiveness and unwavering discipline. When his army moved, it was precise and calculated, leaving little room for error. But Thomas was a brilliant, cunning survivor. In the midst of total panic, as Khalid's forces carved a path toward the city centre, Thomas conceived one of the most desperate, brilliant diplomatic gambles in military history. He knew the Muslim army was divided into different corps, commanded by different generals stationed at different gates. While the terrifying Khalid commanded the east, the western gate, Bab al-Jabir, was commanded by the legendary veteran Abu Ubaidah. And Thomas knew Abu Ubaidah's reputation perfectly. He was known throughout the Levant as a man of profound diplomacy, incredible leniency, and absolute, unbreakable honor. Thomas realized his only chance of survival was to surrender the city to Abu Ubaidah, before Abu Ubaidah found out that Khalid had already broken in. Thomas abandoned his eastern defenses entirely. Accompanied by the city's bishops and wealthy nobles, he sprinted through the dark streets toward the west gate. Arriving at Bab al-Jabir, Thomas frantically called out over the massive stone walls to the Muslim camp below. He demanded to speak directly with Abu Ubaidah. When the venerable Muslim commander approached the gate, Thomas offered the ultimate prize, the immediate, peaceful surrender of Damascus. But Thomas offered desperate terms. He pleaded for a treaty of peace, Sulhan. He requested that no harm come to the citizens, that their property remain intact, that their places of worship be respected, and that he and his soldiers be allowed to leave the city safely. Abu Ubaidah looked up at the massive, seemingly impregnable walls. He had no idea that Khalid and his shock troops were currently fighting their way through the eastern districts. To Abu Ubaidah, this was a miraculous, bloodless victory. It would save the lives of thousands of his men who would have died in a brutal frontal assault. Without hesitation, Abu Ubaidah accepted the terms. He gave his solemn word, binding the entire Rashidun army to the treaty. The heavy iron gates of Bab al-Jabir slowly creaked open. Abu Ubaidah and his corps marched into the western half of Damascus not as conquerors, but as peaceful guarantors. Their swords remained sheathed. What happened next is one of the most surreal and bizarre moments in medieval military history. Two massive Muslim armies were marching toward the exact center of Damascus from opposite directions, experiencing two completely different realities. From the east came Khalid. His armor was covered in blood. His men were roaring battle cries, their swords drawn, stepping over fallen Roman soldiers, taking the city by pure kinetic force. From the west came Abu Ubaidah. His men were marching in perfect, quiet discipline. Their swords were sheathed. Beside them walked Thomas and the Christian bishops, guiding them peacefully through the streets. In the dead center of Damascus, near the Grand Cathedral of St. John, the two armies violently collided. The shock was absolute. Khalid halted his blood-soaked cavalry, He stared in total disbelief. Standing right in front of him was his fellow commander, Abu Ubaidah, casually walking side by side with the enemy General Thomas, the very man who had killed thousands of Muslims with poisoned arrows just weeks prior. Abu Ubaidah looked equally stunned, staring at Khalid's drawn sword and the trail of dead Roman soldiers behind him. Khalid, furious and adrenaline-fueled, pointed his straight Arabian blade at Thomas. He shouted over the chaos, "What is this? We have taken this city by the sword. They are our prisoners." Thomas, terrified, hid behind Abu Ubaidah. Abu Ubaidah stepped forward, raising his hand to halt Khalid's charging cavalry. He spoke with a calm, unshakable authority that cut through the tension of the battlefield. The sources record his exact, legendary response to the sword of Allah. "O Khalid, sheath your sword. I have given them a guarantee of security. By Allah, the word of a Muslim must be honored." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the center of Damascus. The elite veterans of the mobile guard gripped their weapons tightly, looking to Khalid for the order to strike. The Roman nobles held their breath, waiting for the slaughter to begin. Khalid ibn al-Walid was a man of total war. To him, Thomas was an enemy who had inflicted massive casualties on his men and deserved no mercy. The eastern half of the city had been conquered by the blood and sweat of his soldiers, but the Rashidun army was built on something far stronger than just military tactics. It was built on an ironclad foundation of discipline and divine law. Abu Ubaidah was a senior companion of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. His word, once given, was an unbreakable contract before Allah. Khalid stared at Thomas, his jaw clenched. The tension was thick enough to cut with a dagger. Slowly, deliberately, Khalid ibn al-Walid lowered his arm. The heavy, metallic clank of his bloodied sword, sliding back into its scabbard, echoed across the silent stone courtyard. The sword of Allah had yielded to the word of peace. A frantic council of war was immediately held in the city center. The legal situation was a nightmare. Half the city had been taken by force and half by peace. Ultimately, Abu Ubaidah's treaty was extended to cover the entire city of Damascus. The bloodletting was immediately stopped. The citizens were guaranteed their safety, their property, and their places of worship in exchange for the payment of the jizya tax. As for Commander Thomas and the surviving Roman soldiers, Abu Ubaidah honored the agreement. He granted them a 3-day head start. They were allowed to pack whatever they could carry and flee north toward Antioch. For 3 days, the Muslim cavalry would not pursue them. Thomas, completely broken and humiliated, led a massive, tragic convoy of refugees out of the northern gates, abandoning the jewel of the East forever. The fall of Damascus was a seismic shockwave that paralyzed the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Heraclius, sitting in his capital at Antioch, received the horrifying news. The impenetrable fortress had fallen. His massive relief army was dead. His son-in-law was a fleeing refugee. But perhaps the most terrifying realization for the Romans was not the physical loss of the city, but the manner in which it was taken. The Romans had witnessed Khalid's unmatched, terrifying brilliance in deep infiltration and midnight raids. But they had also witnessed the unbreakable, terrifying discipline of Abu Ubaidah, a conquering army that could halt a blood-soaked victory in the very center of a breached city, simply because a promise of peace had been made, was an army unlike any the world had ever seen. The Rashidun army was not a chaotic horde of desert raiders. They were a highly organized, highly disciplined military juggernaut. Damascus belonged to the Muslims. The gates to northern Syria were now blown wide open. But the Eastern Roman Empire was not dead yet. Emperor Heraclius was about to unleash a counter-offensive so massive, so apocalyptic, that it would force Khalid ibn Walid into the greatest and bloodiest battle of his entire life. The siege of Damascus was over, but the true war for the Levant had just begun. August 634 AD. While the colossal siege of Damascus was raging and Khalid ibn al-Walid was violently battering the eastern walls of the city, a lone, exhausted courier arrived from the deep deserts of Arabia. He slipped into the Rashidun siege camp and completely bypassed the command tent of Khalid, the supreme commander. Instead, he sought out the tent of Abu Ubaidah. The courier handed the veteran commander a sealed letter from El-Medina. When Abu Ubaidah broke the seal and read the parchment, his heart sank. The news was catastrophic. Caliph Abu Bakr, the beloved successor to the Prophet and the architect of the entire Syrian, was dead. Umar bin al-Khattab had immediately ascended to the caliphate, and Umar's very first official decree as the ruler of the Islamic Empire was written on that parchment. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, was officially dismissed from supreme command. Abu Ubaidah was ordered to take absolute control of the army immediately. For Abu Ubaidah, this letter was a nightmare. The Muslim army was locked in a brutal stalemate outside the walls of Damascus. Khalid was the undisputed tactical genius keeping the army together. His sheer, terrifying presence was the only thing holding the massive Roman counterattacks at bay. Abu Ubaidah knew that if he announced the death of Abu Bakr and the sudden demotion of their greatest general right now, the morale of the army would shatter. The siege would collapse. So, in an act of incredible strategic foresight and profound humility, Abu Ubaidah folded the letter, hid it inside his robes, and told absolutely no one. For weeks, Abu Ubaidah continued to fight under the command of Khalid. He followed Khalid's orders. He allowed Khalid to lead the daring midnight raid over the moat, and he allowed Khalid to negotiate the final surrender of the city. It was only after Damascus had completely fallen, after the treaties were signed and the Roman garrison had fled, that Abu Ubaidah finally approached Khalid in the center of the conquered city. He handed the sword of Allah, the letter. Khalid read the decree. He had just conquered the jewel of the East. He had annihilated 3 Byzantine armies. He was at the absolute peak of his military glory. Most generals in history, standing in the center of a conquered capital with a fiercely loyal army behind them, would have rebelled against a sudden demotion from a distant politician. But Khalid was not like other generals in history. He looked up from the letter, looked at Abu Ubaidah, and delivered a response that defined the unbreakable discipline of the Rashidun. If Abu Bakr is dead and Umar is caliph, then we hear and obey. Without a single word of protest, Khalid stepped down. Abu Ubaidah was now the supreme commander of the Rashidun forces in Syria. Abu Ubaidah's first days in command were not peaceful. Intelligence quickly reached him that the Roman Empire was already preparing a massive counterstrike. The remnants of the Roman armies that had survived the slaughter at Ajnadin, combined with fresh imperial reinforcements, were converging on a city in the Jordan Valley called Fahl, known to the Romans as Pella. The sources estimate the Roman force numbered up to 50 to 80,000 men. They were commanded by a hardened Roman general named Theodore Tritherius, known to Arabs as Seglar. Their objective was simple: cut the Muslim supply lines back to Arabia and trap the Rashidun army in northern Syria. Abu Ubaidah could not ignore this threat. Leaving a garrison to hold Damascus, the new supreme commander marched his army south toward the Jordan Valley. But Abu Ubaidah quickly realized that commanding an army of 30,000 men against a Roman force nearly 3 times its size required a specific kind of violent, tactical genius. So, Abu Ubaidah immediately appointed Khalid ibn al-Walid as his cavalry commander and chief tactical advisor. As the Muslim army marched down into the low-lying basin of the Jordan Valley, approaching Fahl, the Roman commander, Seglar, watched from the high ground. Seglar knew exactly why the Romans had lost at Ajnadin. The Muslim light cavalry, led by the mobile guard, was simply too fast, too aggressive, and too maneuverable in open terrain. The heavy, rigid Roman formations couldn't keep up. If Seglar fought them in the open plains, he would be outflanked and destroyed. To win, he had to completely neutralize the Arabian horses. And looking at the geography of the Jordan Valley, Seglar found his ultimate weapon. The city of Fahl sat near the Jordan River, surrounded by a complex ancient network of irrigation canals and earthen dams. Under the cover of darkness, Seglar gave a brilliant, desperate order. The Roman engineers violently breached the dams. Millions of gallons of water from the Jordan River and local springs roared out of their channels, flooding outward across the flat plains surrounding Fahl. When the sun rose the next morning, the Muslim vanguard halted in their tracks. The open plains they needed for their cavalry charges had disappeared. In their place was a massive, horrifying sea of deep, thick, freezing mud and standing water. The entire valley floor had been transformed into an impassable, sticky swamp. The trap was perfect. The Roman army sat safely behind the muddy wasteland on solid ground near Fahl. Khalid rode to the edge of the swamp. His horse immediately sank up to its knees in the thick, sucking mud. A cavalry charge was completely impossible. Any horse that tried to cross would be bogged down, exhausted, and easily slaughtered by Roman archers safely positioned on the other side. The Muslim army was completely paralyzed. Seglar had successfully neutralized the greatest weapon the Rashtun army possessed. For days, the two massive armies sat in a tense, freezing standoff. But Seglar knew he couldn't wait for the mud to dry. He decided to try diplomacy as a distraction. He sent a messenger to Abu Ubaidah, offering the Muslim army enough gold and grain to return to Arabia if they simply abandoned the Levant. Abu Ubaidah looked at the Roman gold, then he looked at the flooded valley. He didn't blink. He told the messenger, "We did not come for your gold. We came for your lands and for your souls." The diplomacy had failed. Seglar now knew that the only way out was through the blood of the desert warriors. January 635 AD. The dead of night. Leaving their defensive positions near Fahl, tens of thousands of heavily armored Roman soldiers began to march silently across the firmer paths of the valley. These were hidden paths the Romans had marked before the flooding. Their objective was to hit the Rashtun camp in the pitch black, catch them sleeping, and slaughter them in their tents. But you do not catch the sword of Allah sleeping. Khalid ibn al-Walid had been watching the Roman lines for days. He noticed the shifting of torches. He noticed the sound of heavy armor being moved in the dark. He had anticipated the Roman desperation. He had ordered the entire Muslim army to remain on high alert. The soldiers were sleeping in their armor, with their straight Arabian swords drawn and resting on their chests. The elite mobile guard was already mounted, waiting in the shadows behind the tents. When the massive Roman vanguard finally crashed into the edge of the Muslim camp, they did not find sleeping men. They hit an absolute wall of iron. The Rashtun infantry erupted from the darkness, violently engaging the shocked Roman attackers. A brutal, chaotic night battle exploded across the valley. The clash of steel and the screams of men echoed through the freezing air as the two armies fought bitterly in the dark. For hours, the Roman heavy infantry tried to break the Muslim lines. They were desperate to push the Muslims back so they could gain enough ground to reach solid earth. but Abu Ubaidah's men held their ground with unbreakable discipline. And as the pale light of dawn finally broke over the horizon, Khalid unleashed the counterattack. He didn't charge through the mud. He used the very paths the Romans had used to sneak into the camp. The Muslim cavalry, perfectly fresh and terrifyingly aggressive, surged forward. They slammed into the flanks of the exhausted Roman army. The sheer kinetic shock of the charge shattered the Roman lines. Panic swept through the imperial ranks. The Romans broke and began to flee back toward the city of Fahl. But they had forgotten about the trap they had built for themselves. In the chaos of the retreat and the blinding light of the rising sun, the Byzantine soldiers lost the narrow, firm paths. By the hundreds, they plunged directly back into the flooded, freezing mud they had created weeks earlier. This time, there was no solid ground. The heavy Roman armor, which was supposed to protect them, became their death sentence. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers sank up to their knees, then their waists, in the thick, suffocating swamp. Imagine thousands of men, terrified, drowning in freezing mud, while the elite Arabian horsemen rode along the edges, firing arrows into the mass of struggling bodies. It was no longer a battle. It was a terrifying, slow slaughter in the mud. The Romans were so tightly packed in the swamp that they couldn't even raise their arms to defend themselves. The Muslim archers, with cold, surgical precision, methodically picked off every high-ranking officer they could see. Commander Saglar was killed in the chaos. He was found later, face down in the very mud he had used as a weapon. By the time the sun had fully risen, the massive Roman army of the Jordan Valley was utterly annihilated. Some sources say only a few hundred survived to reach the walls of Fahl. The rest were swallowed by the earth. The Battle of Fahl was yet another catastrophic disaster for Emperor Heraclius. Abu Ubaidah had won his first massive victory as supreme commander, and he had done it by honoring Khalid's tactical genius. The Muslim war machine was now free. The muddy trap was broken, and the army began to push relentlessly north, directly into the freezing, punishing winter of the Levant. The siege of Homs, Emesa, was about to begin. The mud of Fahl had barely dried on the boots of the Rashdun infantry. In the wake of the catastrophic Roman defeat in the flooded Jordan Valley, the gateway to the heart of Asham was finally forced open. The Muslim war machine had shattered the southern defenses of the Byzantine Empire. Now, their eyes turned north, toward the freezing winds and the towering stone walls of Homs. Known to the Romans as Emesa, was the absolute military nerve center of Roman Syria. It was the personal headquarters of Emperor Heraclius before he fled further north to Antioch. It was heavily fortified, heavily garrisoned, and stocked with enough food and weapons to outlast a siege of years. For the new supreme commander, Abu Ubaidah, and his brilliant cavalry commander, Khalid ibn al-Walid, taking Homs was not just a strategic objective, it was the ultimate prize. If Homs fell, the entire Levant would effectively belong to the Muslims. But Emperor Heraclius was a survivor. He had fought the Persians for decades. He knew how to trade space for time, and he was about to set a brilliant, deadly trap to stop the desert warriors before they could even reach the walls of his prized city. As the 30,000 men of the Muslim army marched out of Damascus and pushed north, they entered a treacherous geographical bottleneck. They were marching through the Bekaa Valley, a vast, flat corridor flanked by the towering, jagged peaks of the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountain ranges. It was a beautiful landscape, but tactically, it was a nightmare. There was very little room to maneuver, and Emperor Heraclius knew this perfectly. Instead of hiding all his troops behind the massive walls of Homs, the emperor split his forces. He sent a massive field army, commanded by two veteran Roman generals, marching south to intercept the Muslims head-on. This Roman field army set up their camp in a wide, open plain known as Marj, the Meadow of Rome. When the scouts of the Ar-Rashidun vanguard rode over the ridges, they saw the terrifying sight. Tens of thousands of heavily armored Byzantine infantry and cavalry blocking the main road to Hummus. Their colorful imperial standards fluttered in the freezing wind. For Khalid ibn al-Walid, a field battle was exactly what he wanted. He immediately ordered the mobile guard to prepare for a devastating frontal assault. But before the sword of Allah could draw his blade, frantic scouts galloped into the camp of Abu Ubaidah. They carried horrifying intelligence. The Muslim army was being flanked. Just miles behind their left shoulder, hiding in the shadow of the mountains, was the ancient, colossal fortress city of Baalbek. Baalbek was not just a city. It was a staggering architectural marvel, built on top of the massive stone ruins of the Roman Temple of Jupiter. Its walls were impossibly thick, and packed inside those walls was a highly trained, heavily armed Byzantine garrison. The trap was now perfectly clear. Emperor Heraclius had engineered a masterful dilemma. If Abu Ubaidah and Khalid ibn al-Walid marched forward to fight the massive field army at Marj, the garrison at Baalbek would immediately march out and smash into the rear of the Muslim army. They would be crushed between the hammer and the anvil. But if the Muslims turned around to lay siege to Baalbek, the field army at Marj would march down and crush them against the colossal stone walls of the temple city. The army set up camp right between the two threats. Inside the command tent, Abu Ubaidah and Khalid ibn al-Walid stared at the map. They were trapped in enemy territory. The freezing winter was rapidly approaching. The soldiers were exhausted from months of continuous marching and fighting. Most generals would have ordered a tactical retreat, pulling back to the safety of Damascus to wait for reinforcements. But Abu Ubaidah and Khalid ibn al-Walid operated on a completely different level of military doctrine. They refused to give up a single inch of conquered ground. If the Roman emperor wanted to fight a two-front war, then the Muslims would give him exactly that. They decided on a terrifyingly risky strategy: divide and conquer. Despite being heavily outnumbered in the region, Abu Ubaidah made the bold decision to split the Muslim army in half right in the middle of hostile territory. Abu Ubaidah took command of one half of the army. His objective was the ancient fortress of Baalbek. He had to march on the city, surround it, and completely lock down the Roman garrison so they couldn't intervene. Meanwhile, Khalid ibn al-Walid would take command of the remaining forces, including his elite mobile guard. His objective was the massive field army at Marj. The risk was absolute. If either commander failed, the other would be instantly surrounded and annihilated. There was zero margin for error. As the sun rose over the Bekaa Valley, the two great generals embraced. They separated their forces. Abu Ubaidah marched his infantry toward the towering stone columns of Baalbek. When he arrived, the sheer scale of the Roman defenses was staggering. The walls were built with some of the largest stone blocks ever quarried in human history. But Abu Ubaidah didn't need to batter down the walls. He just needed to trap the Romans inside. He deployed his men in a tight siege ring around the city, cutting off all roads, all supplies, and all communication. The Roman commander inside Baalbek looked out from the high parapets. He saw the disciplined ranks of the Rashidun blocking every exit. He was completely paralyzed. The garrison was entirely neutralized without a single sword being swung. The anvil had been removed. Miles away, Khalid ibn al-Walid received the signal that Baalbek was contained. A terrifying smile crossed the face of the sword of Allah. He was no longer fighting a two-front war. He was now facing a single, static enemy sitting in the open plains of Marj. and nobody in the history of warfare defeated Khalid ibn al-Walid in an open plain. He rode to the front of his army. He ordered the mobile guard to form their devastating wedge formations. The battle for the meadow of Rome was about to begin. The Bekaa Valley was entirely cut in half. To the south, the massive fortress city of Baalbek was completely locked down by Abu Ubaidah. The Roman garrison inside was paralyzed, staring down at the disciplined ranks of the Muslim infantry. And to the north, in the wide, freezing plains of Marj, the massive Roman field army realized they had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought they were setting a trap. They thought they were going to crush the desert warriors between two massive armies. But they looked across the meadow and saw that the Muslim army was only half its normal size. To the Roman commanders, this looked like an easy slaughter. But they had forgotten who was commanding that half. They were staring directly at the mobile guard, led by Khalid ibn al-Walid. Without waiting for the Romans to organize their heavy infantry, Khalid unleashed the storm. He ordered his elite Arabian cavalry to charge, but he did not hit them in the center. The Roman center was a dense, heavily armored phalanx of spears and shields. A frontal charge against tens of thousands of braced Roman spears would have been suicide. Instead, the sword of Allah split his cavalry into two blistering fast wings. They swept out wide, completely bypassing the heavy Roman center, and slammed violently into the vulnerable flanks of the Roman formation. The kinetic shock of the Arabian war horses hitting the Roman lines was devastating. The Roman commander at Marj frantically tried to wheel his infantry around to face the flanking cavalry. But Roman heavy infantry was simply too slow and too rigid to pivot in the middle of a chaotic battlefield. Their heavy iron armor and massive oval shields, designed to push forward in a straight line, became a clumsy death trap when attacked from the sides. As the Roman lines began to buckle and lose their tight formation, Khalid ibn al-Walid signaled his infantry. The Muslim foot soldiers, perfectly synchronized with the cavalry, surged forward with a deafening war cry. They smashed directly into the fracturing Roman center. The massive field army was completely ripped apart. Unable to hold their lines and terrified by the sheer, violent aggression of the Muslim assault, the Roman ranks shattered. The Battle of Marj devolved into a chaotic, bloody rout. It was no longer a tactical formation. It was a desperate fight for survival. Thousands of Roman soldiers were cut down in the freezing mud of the meadow of Rome. The Arabian light cavalry wove through the broken ranks, isolating groups of Roman soldiers and methodically dismantling them. The remnants of the Roman field army dropped their heavy shields, abandoned their supply wagons, and fled desperately toward the north, trying to reach the safety of the towering walls of Homs. But Khalid ibn al-Walid did not let them escape easily. He ordered his light cavalry to relentlessly pursue the fleeing Romans for miles, cutting down stragglers to ensure this army could never regroup and threaten them again. The field army had been annihilated. The northern threat was entirely gone. Miles away, the Roman commander, locked inside the fortress of Baalbek, stood on his colossal stone walls. For weeks, he had looked out over the horizon, waiting for the massive Roman field army to march down from Marj and save him. He had watched the distant dust clouds. He had prayed for the arrival of the imperial banners. He waited and waited, but the horizon remained completely empty. Soon, exhausted, bleeding Roman survivors from the northern battle began to bypass the city. The rumors filtered into the besieged fortress. The field army had been destroyed. Khalid ibn al-Walid had crushed them at Marj. The garrison at Baalbek realized the horrifying truth. No one was coming to save them. Emperor Heraclius's master plan had failed. They were completely alone, surrounded by the veteran infantry of Abu Ubaidah. Their food stores were dwindling. The freezing winter was beginning to seep through the stone walls of the ancient temple of Jupiter. Morale plummeted. The soldiers on the walls began to openly talk of mutiny. The Roman commander knew that if the Muslims breached the walls by force, the rules of war dictated that the entire garrison could be slaughtered and the city sacked. But Abu Ubaidah was not a butcher. He was a statesman. He had deliberately starved the city of hope, knowing that a psychological victory was far cleaner than a bloody siege. So, recognizing that his situation was absolutely hopeless, the Roman commander made the only logical decision left. He raised the white flag. He opened the massive iron gates of Baalbek and formally surrendered the ancient city to Abu Ubaidah. The terms were remarkably generous. The citizens of Baalbek were guaranteed their lives, their property, and the right to practice their Christian faith in exchange for paying the jizya tax. There was no massacre. There was no looting. The two-front trap, Emperor Heraclius's masterful dilemma, had completely failed. Abu Ubaidah had used patience and absolute discipline to conquer one of the most heavily fortified cities in the Levant without losing a single man. And Khalid ibn al-Walid had used sheer, violent speed to crush a massive Roman field army in the open plains. Days later, the commanders of the Rashidun reunited in the center of the Bekaa Valley. They had successfully divided their forces, conquered both threats, and emerged stronger than ever. The road to the north was finally clear. The gateway to Byzantine Syria was wide open. But as the Muslim army began their final march toward the ultimate prize, the massive fortress city of Homs, the sky above them began to darken. The temperature plummeted to freezing levels. Icy winds howled through the mountain passes. Emperor Heraclius had one final weapon left to throw at the desert warriors, a weapon that could not be outflanked and could not be fought with straight Arabian swords. The twin victories at the Bekaa Valley had sent a shockwave through the Roman Empire. The two-front trap had been violently dismantled. The Roman field army was annihilated, and the mighty fortress of Baalbek had surrendered without a single drop of blood being spilled. The Rashidun army was now marching relentlessly north. Their objective was the very heart of Roman power in the Sham, the colossal, impregnable fortress city of Homs. Known to the Romans as Emesa, Homs was not just a city, it was a symbol of imperial dominance. It was the personal headquarters of Emperor Heraclius before the terrifying advance of the desert warriors forced him to flee even further north to Antioch. But as the Muslim vanguard, led by the terrifying mobile guard, finally saw the towering stone walls of Homs looming on the horizon, the sky above them began to betray them. It was late November, in the year 635 AD. The scorching heat of the desert, the environment that the Arabs had mastered for years, was gone. In its place, the sky turned a dark, bruising grey. The sun vanished behind thick, suffocating clouds, and then the wind began to howl. It was the infamous Syrian winter, and historical sources tell us that the winter of 635 was one of the most severe and brutal seasons in recorded memory. The temperature plummeted, the rain turned into freezing, blinding sleet. A bitter, bone-chilling frost settled over the plains of the Levant. The mud of the battlefield froze solid, turning the earth into jagged, icy rock. As Abu Ubaidah and Khalid ibn al-Walid arrived at the gates of Homs, they realized they were no longer just fighting the Roman Empire. They were fighting the earth itself. The Roman governor inside Homs stood on the massive ancient stone parapets. He looked down at the 30,000 Muslim soldiers beginning to pitch their canvas tents in the freezing, icy plains. and the Roman governor smiled. He had thousands of elite Roman infantry safely locked inside the city. The walls of Homs were a staggering engineering marvel, surrounded by a deep moat and fortified with heavy iron gates. The granaries inside the city were packed with enough food, wheat, and oil to last for years. But more importantly, the Roman garrison was prepared for the winter. The Roman soldiers wore thick layers of wool, heavy leather tunics, and fur-lined cloaks. They slept inside thick stone barracks with roaring fires. The Romans looked down at the desert warriors, and they saw men wearing light cotton, coarse linen, and thin desert cloaks. The Arabs wore open leather sandals, completely unsuited for the freezing sleet and the biting frost that was already turning the ground white. The Roman strategy was instantly decided. Emperor Heraclius had sent explicit orders from Antioch. Do not fight them in the open plains. Do not face Khalid ibn al-Walid in battle. Just lock the massive iron gates, stay warm, and let the freezing Syrian winter do the killing for us. The Romans genuinely believed that within a few weeks, the lightly dressed Arabian army would simply freeze to death, or their morale would completely shatter, and they would abandon the siege and retreat back to the warmth of the southern deserts. The siege of Homs settled into a brutal, agonizing stalemate. Days turned into weeks. The freezing rain continued to pour. The biting winds from the mountains cut through the thin canvas tents of the Muslim camp like invisible blades. Inside the city, the Roman soldiers were comfortable. They would stand on the high walls in their heavy furs, eating warm food, and openly taunt the freezing Muslims below. They shouted insults, laughing at the desert warriors shivering in the icy mud. The Romans waited for the inevitable collapse. They waited for the Muslim camp to pack up their tents and flee south. But the camp did not move. A week passed, then a month. December turned into January. The cold became so absolute, so entirely unbearable, that historical records state some of the heavily clothed Roman guards standing on the stone walls literally lost their toes to frostbite. If the heavily armored Romans were losing limbs to the cold, the suffering in the Muslim camp must have been unimaginable. But the Romans did not understand who was sitting outside their walls. They were not facing a standard army of mercenaries fighting for gold. They were facing the Sahaba. They were facing men who had endured starvation, torture, and the burning sands of Arabia for their absolute faith in Allah. Abu Ubaidah walked through the freezing camp every single night. He checked on the men. He ensured that whatever meager fires they could build were shared. He shared their hunger, and he shared their freezing pain. And Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, stood resolute. He ordered his men to remain vigilant. He knew that the Romans were watching them from the walls, waiting for a sign of weakness. Khalid explicitly ordered his soldiers, "Do not show them your pain. Do not let them see you shiver." And so, the desert warriors wrapped whatever thin cloths they had around their bodies. They prayed in the freezing sleet. They stood guard in the biting frost. They endured a level of physical agony that would have broken any other army in human history. The Romans, watching from the high parapets, slowly stopped laughing. Their taunts died in their throats. They looked down at the canvas tents covered in ice, and they realized that these men were not going to leave. The desert warriors were immovable. They were forged in iron and fortified by an unbreakable faith. The psychological warfare completely flipped. The Roman governor realized, with a creeping sense of terror, that if the Arabs could survive this impossible winter in open canvas tents, what would they do when the spring finally arrived? As February approached, the sky slowly began to clear. The freezing rain stopped. The bitter, howling winds began to calm down. The worst of the apocalyptic winter was finally over. The men of the Rashidun army had survived the impossible, and Khalid ibn al-Walid, who had spent months freezing in the mud, staring at the massive stone walls of Homs, had spent that entire time planning a brilliant, violent trap of his own. The spring thaw was coming, and the sword of Allah was ready to strike. March, 636 AD. The brutal, suffocating grip of the Syrian winter finally began to loosen. The dark, bruising clouds broke apart. The freezing sleet turned back into rain, and the icy frost covering the plains of Asham slowly began to melt back into thick, heavy mud. Spring had arrived. The Roman governor of Homs stood on his high stone balcony and looked out over the massive walls. He expected to look down and see a graveyard. He expected to see the desert warriors frozen to death or broken by disease and starvation. But what he saw sent a cold shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the winter. The Rashidun army was still there. Their canvas tents were battered and stained with mud, but the men standing outside of them were entirely unbroken. They were sharpening their straight Arabian swords. They were tending to their war horses. They had survived the impossible, and now they were looking up at the walls of Homs with a terrifying, predatory patience. Inside the Muslim command tent, Abu Ubaidah and Khalid ibn al-Walid held a critical war council. They had survived the elements, but tactically they were still facing a massive problem. The stone walls of Homs were simply too thick to breach with the limited siege equipment the Muslims possessed, and the deep moat surrounding the city made a direct infantry assault completely suicidal. If they stayed outside the walls, the siege could drag on for another entire year. But Khalid ibn al-Walid did not want to wait a year. The sword of Allah knew that the greatest weakness of the Roman military was not their armor, and it was not their walls. It was their arrogance. Khalid looked at the map and proposed one of the most difficult and highly disciplined tactical maneuvers in the history of warfare: the feigned retreat. He told Abu Ubaidah, "We cannot break their walls, so we must invite them to walk out of their own gates. We must make them believe that the winter finally broke us." Executing a fake retreat with 30,000 men is incredibly dangerous. If the men actually panic, a fake retreat can turn into a real slaughter. It required absolute, unbreakable discipline. Every single soldier had to play their part perfectly. Before dawn the next morning, the Muslim camp suddenly erupted into chaotic movement. From the walls of Homs, the Roman sentries watched in absolute shock. The Muslims were aggressively tearing down their tents. They were haphazardly strapping their supplies to the pack camels. They left behind broken equipment and discarded firewood, deliberately making their camp look like a panicked, disorganized mess. And then, the entire Rashidun army turned their backs on the city and began to march south. They were retreating. They were marching back toward the Bekaa Valley, back toward Damascus. The Roman sentries frantically blew their horns. The governor of Homs rushed to the battlements. He looked out over the muddy plains and saw the rearguard of the Muslim army disappearing over the southern ridges. The governor's shock quickly turned into blinding, arrogant greed. He thought to himself, "They are exhausted, they are starving. The freezing winter finally broke their morale. They are fleeing. If the governor let them escape, Emperor Heraclius would be furious. But if the governor marched out right now and chased down the exhausted, fleeing Muslims, he would be the hero of the Roman Empire. He would be the man who finally destroyed Khalid ibn al-Walid." The governor screamed the orders. "Open the gates, sound the attack." The massive iron-reinforced gates of Homs, which had been bolted shut for months, violently groaned open. The heavy wooden drawbridges slammed down across the moat. tens of thousands of elite Roman heavy cavalry and infantry poured out of the city. They were fresh, they were warm, they were heavily armored, and they were sprinting south, desperate to catch the fleeing desert warriors before they could escape. For several miles, the Roman army pushed hard across the open plains, tracking the deep footprints left by the retreating Muslims in the mud. The Romans were completely out of formation. They were not marching in their tight, disciplined shield walls. They were rushing forward in a massive, disorganized mob, driven by the pure excitement of the hunt. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they were walking directly into the jaws of the lion. Miles away, perfectly hidden behind a series of elevated ridges, the Muslim army had completely halted. They were not exhausted, they were not panicked. They were standing in absolute, terrifying silence, in perfect battle formations. Khalid ibn al-Walid sat atop his massive Arabian warhorse, watching the horizon. He was waiting. He had to wait until the Roman army was so far away from the walls of Homs that they could not turn around and run back inside when the trap was sprung. He waited until the Roman vanguard finally crested the ridge. The Roman soldiers stopped dead in their tracks. The excitement drained from their faces, instantly replaced by cold, paralyzing horror. The Muslims were not running, they were waiting for them. Before the Roman commanders could even scream the order to form their shield walls, Khalid ibn al-Walid drew his sword. The signal was given. The trap violently snapped shut. The elite mobile guard, completely fresh and terrifyingly aggressive, erupted from the flanks. They didn't just charge the Roman front, they swept in massive, blinding arcs to the left and right, completely encircling the disorganized Byzantine army. Simultaneously, Abu Ubaidah ordered the heavy infantry forward. With a deafening roar of Allahu Akbar, the Muslim foot soldiers smashed directly into the panicked Roman center. The kinetic shock of the ambush was absolute devastation. The Roman soldiers were caught completely in the open. They had no defensive trenches. They had no shield wall. And worst of all, they were miles away from the safety of their towering stone gates. The battle of the feigned retreat devolved into an immediate, brutal slaughter. The Arabian light cavalry tore through the disorganized Roman lines with surgical precision. The heavy iron armor of the Byzantines, which had kept them warm all winter, now dragged them down in the spring mud as they desperately tried to flee. But there was nowhere to run. The mobile guard had already cut off their retreat back to the city. Thousands of elite Roman soldiers were cut down in the open plains. The governor's arrogant dream of glory had turned into a catastrophic nightmare. The garrison of Homs was completely annihilated in a matter of hours. As the sun began to set over the blood-soaked plains, Khalid ibn al-Walid wiped his blade. The Roman army was destroyed, and the massive iron gates of Homs were left completely undefended. The mud of the plains was no longer frozen. It was soaked in the blood of the Byzantine heavy infantry. The brilliant, highly disciplined, feigned retreat executed by Khalid ibn al-Walid had completely shattered the Roman garrison of Homs. The arrogant governor, who had laughed at the freezing desert warriors from the safety of his high stone walls, was dead. The massive Roman army that had marched out of the iron gates just hours earlier had been utterly erased. The Arashidun army did not even need to lay siege to the city anymore. With their military completely destroyed in the open plains, the panicked citizens and the surviving local officials inside Homs immediately raised the white flags of surrender. They had watched the absolute annihilation of their protectors from the parapets. They knew that resistance was completely futile. Abu Ubaidah, the supreme commander, rode slowly toward the open gates. He did not order a sack of the city. He did not allow his men to exact revenge for the months of freezing agony and psychological torture they had endured in the winter sleet. Instead, Abu Ubaidah offered them the exact same terms of justice and mercy that he had offered at Damascus and Baalbek. The citizens of Homs were granted absolute protection. Their massive stone churches would remain untouched. Their property and their lives were guaranteed in exchange for the payment of the jizya tax. The Muslim army, exhausted, battered, and carrying the physical scars of the brutal Syrian winter, finally marched into the warmth of the colossal fortress city. The conquest of Homs was an absolute, monumental milestone in the history of the Islamic conquests. The Muslims had not just taken a city, they had taken the personal headquarters of Emperor Heraclius. They had seized the strategic nerve center of the entire region. The Arashidun war machine now firmly controlled the Levant, pushing their borders terrifyingly close to the northern mountains of Anatolia. But while the desert warriors finally rested inside the warm stone barracks of Homs, the geopolitical shockwaves of their victory were rapidly traveling north. Miles away, in the coastal capital of Antioch, Emperor Heraclius received the catastrophic dispatch. Damascus had fallen, the Bekaa Valley had fallen, and now his prized jewel, Homs, had fallen. The emperor sat in absolute silence. He realized, finally, that he was not fighting a disorganized band of desert raiders. He was fighting a highly disciplined, tactically brilliant, and religiously unified military juggernaut. Heraclius knew he needed to completely change his strategy. Sending single armies to fight Khalid ibn al-Walid was nothing but suicide. The emperor stood up from his throne. He issued a terrifying, unprecedented imperial decree. He ordered the complete, total mobilization of the entire Byzantine Empire. He sent messengers into the deep mountains of Armenia. He called upon the Christian Arab tribes of the north. He pulled elite, heavy cavalry from the frontiers of Europe. He emptied the imperial treasuries, and he ordered every available man who could carry a sword or hold a spear to march. Heraclius was no longer trying to defend his cities. He was building a colossal, apocalyptic coalition force, an army so unfathomably massive that it would literally drown the Muslim forces in a sea of iron and blood. The era of sieges was over. The gathering storm had begun. Late in the year 635 AD, the colossal, impregnable fortress city of Homs had fallen. The conquest of this strategic nerve center had pushed the borders of the Islamic Caliphate terrifyingly close to the northern mountains of Anatolia. The Arashidun war machine had systematically dismantled the Roman defenses in Asham. They had shattered every single field army thrown at them. They had survived the blinding sleet and the freezing frost of the apocalyptic Syrian winter. And now, as the spring thaw turned the frozen plains into thick mud, the desert warriors finally rested. They slept inside the warm, ancient stone barracks of the conquered city. For a brief, fleeting moment, the Muslim army felt a sense of absolute security. They believed the back of the Roman Empire had been permanently broken. But they were wrong. Miles away, in the fortified coastal capital of Antioch, Emperor Heraclius was not broken. He was a brilliant, hardened veteran of decades of war. And as he read the catastrophic dispatches detailing the fall of Damascus, the Bekaa Valley, and now his prized jewel of Homs, a terrifying, cold realization washed over him. Sending single, isolated armies to fight Khalid ibn al-Walid was nothing but suicide. The Syrian theatre of war was a giant arena. To the west lay the Mediterranean, a Roman lake where the Roman fleets moved freely. But to the east lay the unforgiving desert, where the Arabs were absolute masters. Heraclius knew that if the Muslims faced defeat, they would simply melt back into the sands, where his heavy infantry could not follow. If Emperor Heraclius wanted to turn this string of humiliating, bloody defeats into a glorious, crushing triumph, he could not just fight the Arabs. He had to trap them. He had to completely, utterly annihilate them. He needed to raise an army so unfathomably massive, so overwhelming in its sheer scale, that few, if any, Muslims would ever escape his clutches. And so, Emperor Heraclius issued an imperial decree that would shake the very foundations of the known world. He ordered the total, absolute mobilization of the Roman Empire. He emptied the ancient imperial treasuries, pouring rivers of gold to fund the ultimate war. He declared a holy crusade, sending bishops and priests across the land to exhort every man to fight in defense of their faith and to save their lands from the alien invaders. Tens of thousands of Christians took the solemn oath of death, swearing on the cross that they would die fighting before they ever fled the battlefield. Throughout the spring of 636, the earth trembled as entire corps of soldiers began to march toward Antioch. The sheer scale of the gathering was apocalyptic. By May, an unimaginable, staggering force of 150,000 men had been assembled. This was not just a Roman army. It was a terrifying, multinational coalition of iron and blood. It consisted of elite heavy infantry from the Balkans, fierce Slavic and Russian axemen who had never seen the deserts of Arabia, Frankish mercenaries clad in heavy chainmail, seasoned Greek veterans of the Persian Wars, heavily armored Georgians, and tens of thousands of elite Armenian cavalry. Emperor Heraclius looked upon this ocean of spears and divided the colossal juggernaut into 5 distinct, massive armies, each numbering roughly 30,000 men. The supreme command of the entire imperial force was given to a hardened, brilliant Armenian king named Mahan. Under Mahan were 4 terrifying commanders: Kanatir, a ruthless Russian prince commanding the Slavs; Gregory and Derjan, commanding the heavy European infantry; and finally, Jabla bin al-Aham, the king of the Christian Ghassanid Arabs. When Emperor Heraclius dispatched Jabla and his light Christian Arab cavalry to act as the vanguard, he looked at the Arab king and delivered a chilling, calculated strategic doctrine. Everything is destroyed by its own kind, and nothing cuts steel but steel. While this apocalyptic storm was gathering in the north, the Muslim forces were entirely unaware and terrifyingly vulnerable. To govern the massive territories they had conquered over the last 2 years, the Arashidun army had split into 4 separate, widely dispersed corps. Amr ibn al-As was far to the south in Palestine. Shurahbil was holding the territory of Jordan. Yazid was tied down, besieging the coastal fortress of Caesarea. And the supreme commander, Abu Ubaidah, along with Khalid ibn al-Walid, were sitting isolated in the far north at Homs and the outpost of Shaizar. The Muslims were completely spread out over hundreds of miles, and Emperor Heraclius, with his brilliant tactical mind, saw the fatal flaw. The emperor devised a masterclass in grand strategy. He reinforced the coastal city of Caesarea by sea with 40,000 fresh troops just to pin down Yazid, ensuring the Muslim commander could not march north to help his brothers. Then, Heraclius launched the 5 heads of his coalition Hydra. His plan was flawless. Kanatir would march down the coast to Beirut, then cut sharply east to approach Damascus from the west, completely severing the Muslim escape route. Jabla would march straight down the center from Aleppo via Hama to pin the Muslims frontally at Homs. Derjan would sweep in from the west to strike their left flank. Gregory would strike from the northeast, and Mahan would follow behind as a massive, overwhelming reserve. The trap was set. The Muslim army at Homs was about to be swallowed whole by a force 10 times its size, attacked from all 4 directions simultaneously, with absolutely every single escape route completely severed. The colossal Roman armies began their march south. The earth shook beneath the boots of 150,000 men. But the Muslims possessed a weapon that Emperor Heraclius could not account for. It wasn't swords, and it wasn't armor. It was an elite, deeply embedded intelligence network. The Muslims had established a brilliant system of spies across the land. Nothing moved in Asham without their knowledge. While stationed near Shaizar, Muslim cavalry intercepted a Roman convoy. Through interrogating the prisoners and gathering reports from local informants, the terrifying reality began to trickle in. As the days lengthened into weeks, the pieces of intelligence were put together like a horrifying jigsaw puzzle. The dispatches were rapidly relayed back to the Muslim headquarters at Homs. The officers of the Ar-Rashidun army were staggered. Every single report that arrived was worse than the last. The horizon was turning black with Roman iron. But Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, did not panic. With his unerring, predatory sense of strategy, Khalid looked at the map and instantly saw the exact design of the emperor's trap. He saw the 5 converging armies. He saw the coastal reinforcements at Caesarea, and he saw that standing their ground at Homs meant absolute total annihilation. Khalid turned to the supreme commander, Abu Ubaidah, and delivered the hardest, most bitter strategic advice of the entire war. They could not hold the north. They could not hold central Syria. They had to abandon their hard-won conquests. They had to pull back every single scattered corps. They had to abandon Damascus and fall back hundreds of miles south to the strategic junction of Jabia. They had to consolidate into one single unified army before the Roman jaws snapped shut. To win the war, they had to give up everything they had bled for. Abu Ubaidah, trusting the tactical genius of Khalid without question, immediately accepted the bitter reality. He issued the orders. The great retreat was to begin. But before the Muslim army marched out of the gates of Homs, Abu Ubaidah performed an act of moral justice so profoundly staggering, so entirely unheard of in the ancient world, that it has never been replicated in the history of human warfare. He ordered his treasurers to bring forward all of the gold and silver they had collected from the Christian and Jewish citizens of the city as the jizya tax. The citizens of Homs were called to the city square. They stood nervously, watching the battle-hardened desert warriors preparing their pack camels, getting ready to flee the incoming Roman juggernaut. And then, the supreme commander of the Islamic army began to hand the gold back. Abu Ubaidah looked at the bewildered citizens and spoke the absolute truth. "We collected this tax in exchange for protecting you for your enemies, but the massive armies of Rome are coming, and we are no longer able to help and defend you. You are now on your own. Take your wealth back." The citizens of Homs were moved to tears. In an era where retreating armies would routinely pillage, burn, and slaughter their own subjects to deny resources to the enemy, this level of pure, unshakable justice was entirely alien. The Christian citizens looked at Abu Ubaidah and replied, "Your rule and your justice are dearer to us than the oppression and cruelty in which we existed before." The local Jewish population was so fiercely loyal to their new Muslim governors that they swore the Roman officers would not enter the city except over their dead bodies. And it was not just Homs. Abu Ubaidah sent riders to every single Muslim commander across Asham, ordering them to refund the jizya to the local populations before they retreated. Not a single coin was kept unjustly. With their conscience clear and their faith unbroken, the Ar-Rashidun army turned their backs on the cities they had conquered and began the desperate, massive march south. They were giving up the cities, but they were not giving up the war. They were drawing the colossal Roman army away from their supply lines. Days later, the brutal Russian prince, Kanatir, violently breached the western gates of Damascus in joyful anticipation of slaughtering the trapped Muslims. But as his heavily armed Slavs poured into the city, they found nothing but ghosts. There was not a single Muslim soldier left. The birds had flown. They were heading toward a sprawling, flat plain, a place where the Arabian cavalry could run free, bordered by a deep, jagged, terrifying ravine. The decision to retreat was a masterstroke of cold, calculated logic. But for the common soldier, it was a bitter pill to swallow. As the order from Abu Ubaidah rippled through the ranks, the Rashidun warriors began the grueling process of dismantling their camps. For 2 years, they had bled for every inch of Syrian soil. They had fought through the dust of Ajnadain and the freezing mud of Homs. Now they were turning their backs on it all. To the outside observer, it looked like a collapse. To the Roman scouts watching from the hills, it looked like the desert wolves were finally running home with their tails between their legs. But as the massive columns of camel cavalry and infantry began their march south, there was no panic. There was only a terrifying, disciplined silence. They were not fleeing, they were recoiling like a spring, winding themselves tighter and tighter for a single final strike. Meanwhile, in the Roman high command, the mood was one of arrogant confusion. The brutal Russian prince, Kanatir, and the Armenian king Mahan watched as the northern cities fell into their laps without a single drop of blood being spilled. As Kanatir violently breached the western gates of Damascus, he expected to find a trapped, desperate enemy. Instead, he found a city that had been perfectly settled. The markets were open, the citizens were safe, and the Muslim barracks were swept clean. Not a single spear had been left behind. The Roman generals were baffled. They had expected a siege, they found a vacuum. They had expected a slaughter, they found ghosts. This was the hidden genius of Khalid ibn al-Walid. By retreating, he was doing something far more dangerous than fighting. He was stretching the Roman juggernaut. For every mile the Romans marched south, their supply lines grew longer and thinner. Their 150,000-man army required mountains of grain and thousands of gallons of water every single day. By drawing them away from the fertile north and toward the barren edges of the desert, the Muslims were slowly starving the giant they were about to fight. As the sun set over the dusty trails of the south, the Rashidun army reached the strategic junction of Jabia. Here, the 4 scattered corps finally reunited. For the first time in months, 34,000 veterans of the desert stood shoulder to shoulder, their faith unbroken, their ranks unified. Behind them lay the vast, open sands of Arabia, their eternal refuge. But marching relentlessly toward them was an ocean of Roman swords. The great retreat was over. The talking was done. The Muslims had given up the cities to save the cause. They had returned the wealth of the people to uphold their honor. And now they stood at Jabia, staring down a multinational coalition nearly 5 times their size. The cities had been abandoned. The gold had been returned. Across the length and breadth of Asham, the impossible had happened. The all-conquering Rashidun army, the desert warriors who had shattered every single Byzantine defense for the last 2 years, had simply vanished. They had left the colossal fortress of Homs. They had marched out of the ancient gates of Damascus. They had willingly given up every single inch of the land they had bled for, returning the jizyat tax to the bewildered Christian and Jewish citizens, leaving them in the hands of God. It was the greatest, most flawlessly executed, strategic retreat in the history of the ancient world. Led by the supreme commander Abu Ubaidah and guided by the tactical genius of the sword of Allah, Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Muslim forces were falling back hundreds of miles south, recoiling like a giant spring. But they were not running from a battle. They were choosing exactly where to fight it. While the Romans with their massive army were marching south with one singular, terrifying objective: to pin the Muslims against the unforgiving desert and wipe them from the face of the earth. The tension across the Levant was suffocating. The air itself felt heavy with the promise of catastrophic violence. The talking was over. The game of cat and mouse had reached its terrifying, inevitable conclusion. The imperial juggernaut was finally in motion. Emperor Heraclius had unleashed a terrifying, multinational coalition of 150,000 men to completely envelop and annihilate the desert warriors. But as the 5 massive Roman armies closed the jaws of their flawless trap around Homs and Damascus, they found nothing but ghosts. Through brilliant, flawlessly executed intelligence, Abu Ubaidah and Khalid ibn al-Walid had slipped the noose. The Arashidun army had safely extricated themselves from the jaws of death, abandoning their northern conquests and executing a massive, highly coordinated retrograde movement. They marched relentlessly south to a strategic junction called Jabia. It was here, at Jabia, that the scattered, fragmented core of the Muslim army finally reunited. The supreme commander, Abu Ubaidah, and Khalid were joined by the forces of Shurahbil from Jordan, Amru ibn al-As from Palestine, and elements of Yazid's corps. For the first time in months, the entire military might of the Islamic Caliphate in Asham was concentrated in one single location. But even combined, they numbered barely 34,000 men, and marching relentlessly toward them was an ocean of Roman swords. By the middle of July, the terrifying reality of the situation finally caught up with them. The light cavalry screens of the Christian Arabs made contact with the Muslim outposts just north of Jabia. A battle was now absolutely certain, and it was a battle that would permanently decide the fate of Islam in the Levant. Abu Ubaidah was deeply worried. He did not fear for his own life. He had long ago surrendered his fate to Allah, but he worried for the survival of the Sahaba and the survival of the Muslim cause. He looked at the terrifying intelligence reports detailing the sheer, unfathomable size of the Roman coalition. To the Muslims, who believed the enemy force to be as large as 200,000, it felt like a horrible waking nightmare. Abu Ubaidah immediately called a council of war. He gathered his top generals inside his command tent to brief them on the apocalyptic enemy strength. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the tent. The officers sat, weighed down by the forbidding, impossible prospect that faced them. One commander finally broke the silence, suggesting the unthinkable: a total withdrawal back into the deep deserts of Arabia. They could wait out the Roman storm in the harsh sands where the heavy Byzantine infantry could not follow, and attempt to re-enter Asham years later. But this proposal was immediately rejected. It was tantamount to abandoning every single inch of ground they had bled for, exchanging the good life of Syria for the harsh hunger of the desert. Most of the assembled officers spoke in favor of planting their feet at Jabia. They would fight here and now, trusting in Allah for victory. But the mood in the council was not one of happy, eager enthusiasm. It was a mood of grim, terrifying determination. They were preparing to go down fighting. Throughout the entire agonizing debate, Khalid ibn al-Walid had remained completely silent. The sword of Allah simply listened, his tactical mind running through thousands of different battlefield permutations. Finally, Abu Ubaidah turned to him. "O father of Suleiman," Abu Ubaidah said, "you are a man of courage and resolve and judgment. What do you think of all this?" Khalid looked at the supreme commander. "What they say is good," Khalid replied respectfully. "I have different views, but shall not oppose the Muslims." Abu Ubaidah, knowing that Khalid possessed a military genius that eclipsed everyone else in the room, insisted. "If you have other views, speak, and we shall do as you say." Khalid stepped forward and completely dismantled the plan to fight at Jabia. "Know, O commander," Khalid began, pointing at the tactical map, "that if you stay at this place, you will be actively helping the enemy against you. In the coastal city of Caesarea, which is not far from Jabia, There are 40,000 Roman troops under the command of Constantine, the son of Emperor Heraclius. Khalid explained the fatal flaw. If they fought the main Byzantine coalition facing north at Jabia, Constantine could easily advance from Caesarea and smash directly into their rear. They would be crushed between the hammer and the anvil. Khalid delivered his masterstroke. "I advise you to move from here. We must place the town of Azra behind us, and we must be on the Yarmouk." The plains of Yarmouk. Khalid knew that moving to this specific geographical location solved everything. It secured their rear from flanking attacks. It kept their supply lines to the deserts of Arabia wide open, making it easier for the Caliph to send reinforcements. And most importantly, ahead of them would be a large, flat plain, absolutely perfect for the devastating charges of the Arabian cavalry. The Council of War was stunned by the sheer brilliance of the strategic read. The plan was unanimously accepted. The entire Muslim army packed their camps and began to execute the retrograde maneuver southeast, abandoning Jabia. But withdrawing in the face of a 150,000-man army is incredibly dangerous. Someone had to hold the line. Khalid ibn al-Walid took command of his elite mobile guard, 4,000 of the most heavily armored, battle-hardened horsemen in the world, and stayed behind as the rearguard. Instead of waiting defensively, Khalid rode violently forward. He clashed directly with the leading elements of the massive Roman army on the Jabia axis. The kinetic shock of the mobile guard was so devastating that Khalid actually drove the head of the colossal Roman column backward toward Damascus. This sudden, hyper-aggressive strike terrified the Roman commanders. It imposed a creeping, paralyzing caution on the Byzantine coalition. They made absolutely no effort to interfere with the retrograde move of the Muslims. A few days later, Khalid safely rejoined the main body of the Rashidun army. The Muslims had arrived at the eastern part of the plain of Yarmouk. They began to dig in, adjusting their camps to correspond to a battlefront running from the river to the Jabia road, facing northwest. But to understand the bloodbath that is about to unfold, you must understand the terrifying, alien geography of this battlefield. It was not just a flat, open field. It was a natural, megalithic fortress and a potential death trap. The plain was enclosed on its western and southern sides by massive, plunging, apocalyptic ravines. On the west yawned the terrifying Wadi Rakad, a deep, jagged gorge with banks plunging 1,000 feet down. The ravine was lined with precipices, creating sheer vertical rock drops of up to 200 feet in height. There was only one main crossing, at a narrow ford near modern-day Kafir-ul-Mar. To the south ran the canyon of the Yarmouk River itself, twisting and turning for 15 miles. If an army was pushed to the edge of the Wadi Rakad, there was nowhere to run. There was no retreat. There was only a terrifying plunge into the abyss. It was on this jagged, claustrophobic plain, bordered by cliffs of death, that the two greatest empires of the age would finally collide. A few days later, the horizon to the northwest turned completely black. The imperial army of Emperor Heraclius had arrived. 150,000 men poured onto the plains. To the Muslims watching from their outposts, the Romans looked like a terrifying, endless swarm of locusts. The Byzantine camp was so unfathomably massive that it stretched for 18 miles across the horizon. The two armies settled into their respective camps, separated by a few miles of central plain. The tension was suffocating. Both sides began feverish preparations, reconnaissances, checking of equipment, and finalizing battle plans. But Emperor Heraclius had given his commander-in-chief one explicit instruction: before you drown them in blood, try to negotiate. Vahan initiated the psychological warfare. He sent one of his top European generals, Gregory, to ride out to the Muslim camp and hold talks with Abu Ubaidah. Gregory offered the Muslims a fortune. He told the supreme commander that the Arabs could take everything they had acquired in Asham and leave in peace, as long as they swore never to invade Roman territory again. Abu Ubaidah's answer was a flat, unyielding negative. Gregory returned empty-handed. Next, Vahan sent Jabla, the king of the Christian Arabs, hoping that an Arab would have more success persuading his fellow Arabs to leave in peace. Jabla tried his absolute best, but like Gregory, he returned entirely unsuccessful. The unshakable faith of the Sahaba could not be bought. Realizing that words were useless, Mahan decided to test the Muslim resolve with steel. In late July of 636, Mahan ordered Jabla to take the bulk of his mobile Ghassanid Arab cavalry and launch a massive probing attack against the Muslim lines. It was a reconnaissance in force designed to test the strength of the Muslim front. But as Jabla's cavalry cautiously inched their way forward, they suddenly found themselves assailed. Khalid ibn al-Walid unleashed powerful, localized squadrons of the Arabian light cavalry, violently countercharging the Roman vanguard. After a brief, half-hearted resistance, the terrified Christian Arabs broke and withdrew. The probing attack was a failure, confirming Mahan's deepest fear. Destroying these desert warriors was going to be a horribly bloody affair. And so, a bizarre, agonizing standoff began. For almost an entire month, there was absolutely no major action on the plain of Yarmouk. The Muslims were not strong enough to take the initial offensive against 150,000 men, and the Romans simply did not feel brave enough to attack the unbroken lines of the desert veterans. But this month-long delay proved to be a fatal mistake for the Byzantines. During this respite, a massive dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon. The Muslims rushed to the edge of their camps. It was the banners of Islam. Caliph Umar had marched a fresh contingent of 6,000 reinforcements all the way from the Yemen. The Muslim army swelled to 40,000 warriors. But it was not just the numbers, it was the caliber of these men. Among the reinforcements were 1,000 pure companions of the Prophet, the Sahaba, and among them were 100 legendary veterans of the Battle of Badr, the very first, holiest battle in the history of Islam. Citizens of the absolute highest rank rode onto the plains of Yarmouk. The Prophet's own cousin, Zubair, one of the Blessed Ten, arrived in heavy armor. The legendary Quraysh leader Abu Sufyan arrived, alongside his fierce, unyielding wife, Hind. The morale of the Muslim army absolutely exploded. They were no longer just an army, they were the physical manifestation of the Islamic faith, gathered in one place, ready to wage holy war against the greatest superpower on earth. When month had passed, Vahan the Armenian finally felt ready to take the offensive, but he decided to make one final, desperate attempt at peace. He asked for a Muslim envoy to be sent directly to his headquarters. In response, Abu Ubaidah sent his greatest weapon. He sent Khalid. Khalid rode into the colossal, 18-mile-long Roman camp. He walked into Mahan's luxurious command pavilion, facing the sheer apocalyptic size of the Armenian king's great army. Mahan offered a vast, unimaginable sum of money to all the Muslims, including the Caliph in Medina, if they would just go home. Whispers spread through the pavilion, but Khalid stood completely unfazed. He looked the Armenian commander-in-chief dead in the eyes and offered him the exact same 3 terms he had presented to every single Roman general before him: Islam, the jizya, or the sword. Mahan stared at the unbending Arabian commander. He realized these men could not be intimidated. Mahan chose the sword. Though both commanders were actually favorably impressed by each other's courage, Abu Ubaidah would later remark about Mahan, "Satan has got hold of his reason." As the 2 greatest military commanders of the age parted ways, They both knew that the talking was permanently over. The point of no return had been crossed. The rest of the day was spent in feverish, terrifying activity. Both sides finalized plans, issued orders, and placed regiments into position. Officers and men checked their armor and weapons. Fervent prayers were offered to the same God for victory. As the sun slowly set over the jagged, terrifying cliffs of the Wadi Rakad, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the plains of Yarmouk. On one side sat 40,000 desert warriors, fortified by the legendary veterans of Badr. On the other side sprawled 150,000 heavily armored Romans, desperate to save their crumbling empire. Tomorrow morning, the earth will shake. 6 days of absolute apocalyptic warfare are about to begin. If you are ready to witness the largest and bloodiest battle in the history of the ancient world, you must hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon right now. We are expanding our historical universe. If you want to experience the authentic, beautifully detailed histories of the prophets and the channel, make sure to join our brand new channel, Islamic Story Lens. The link is in the description below. And if you cannot wait another second to see the 6-day apocalypse unfold, you can watch Battle of Yarmouk like never seen before, right now, completely ad-free on our Patreon. Until next time, keep your swords sharp. The storm has arrived.